You're tuning in to the deep dive, where we take a whole stack of information and really try to pull out the crucial bits you need to know. Efficiently, but with some perspective, too.
And today we're looking at edible shrimp. And these chemicals that, well, they've been getting a lot of attention, PFAS.
Right, these and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and for good reason, like you said. They don't break down easily, they stick around.
Exactly. And there's growing concern about potential health effects. So this study we're digging into looks specifically at shrimp, something a lot of us eat, and how much PFAS we might be finding there.
Yeah, we've got this scientific paper. They meticulously tested PFAS levels in, those retail packs of shrimp you buy from Japan and some neighboring countries. So our mission today is basically to boil this research down. What's really important for you to grasp about PFAS in shrimp? Like, how common is it? What are the levels? Does it change depending on where the shrimp's from? And what might it mean for us?
We'll try and keep the chemistry jargon to a minimum.
Definitely. We'll break it down. Okay, let's dive in.
So I think the first thing that jumps out is just how widespread these PFAS are. The study looked at 30 different packs of shrimp, 7 species, 8 coastal areas.
Okay.
And they found detectable PFAS in every single one.
Wow. Okay, so it wasn't if they were there, but more like which ones and how much.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the persistence and ubiquity of these compounds in the marine environment, I think.
Right. So were there particular PFAS that showed up most often?
Yes, definitely. 2 really stood out. PFOS, that's perfluorooctane sulfonate, and PFUsDA, perfluoroundecanoic acid.
PFOS rings a bell. PFIDA. Maybe less so for most people.
Possibly. But together, these 2 accounted for something like 46% of the total PFAS they measured. Almost half.
Okay, and what about the actual amounts? Were the levels high, low?
Well, the total concentrations varied. They range from about 1.5 up to 10 nanograms per gram. Wet weight, that's the weight as you'd eat it.
1.5 to 10 nanograms. Is that a lot? It's hard to picture.
It's a relevant range, let's say. But the key thing is, it wasn't the same everywhere. It really depended on the type of shrimp and where it was caught.
Right. You mentioned species and location. Did the study flag any specific examples that had particularly high levels?
Yeah, they did. For instance, Alaskan pink shrimp from the Hokuriku coast of Japan. These had high levels of what are called long-chain PFCAs.
Long chain. Just means a bigger molecule, basically.
Yeah, longer carbon chain. These reached about 38 nanograms per gram dry weight, which translates to roughly 8.7 beast wet weight.
Okay, 8.7, so towards the higher end of that range you mentioned.
Exactly. And then there was red rice prawn from Yamaguchi, also in Japan.
Yeah.
That one had a high concentration of PFOS, specifically around 29 dry weight or 6.7 peak wet weight.
Interesting. So specific types in specific places showing higher loads. Let's talk more about location. What geographical patterns did they find?
This is where it gets quite interesting, actually. The researchers noticed that those long-chain PFCAs, the ones high in the Alaskan pink shrimp, they tended to be higher in shrimp from Japanese coastal waters compared to shrimp from the South China Sea.
Okay, so a difference between those regions for those specific compounds.
Right, but then PFOS, which was high in the red rice prawn, its levels didn't show such clear geographical differences. It seemed more uniformly spread, perhaps.
Huh. That's a key distinction. So the long chain stuff seems more concentrated maybe in certain Japanese waters, while PFOS is just kind of everywhere. Any ideas why?
Well, the study speculates a bit. For the long-chain PFCAs in Japan, it could be linked to, specific local inputs, maybe historical pollution, or even the breakdown of newer PFAS chemicals that are currently used, forming these as transformation products.
Ah, so they might be forming in the environment from other things.
Potentially. They also found branch PFCAs slight variations in the chemical structure, primarily in shrimp from Japanese coastal waters, and even more specifically in semi-enclosed areas like the Seto Inland Sea and Suruga Bay.
Suggesting the local water conditions, maybe how flushed out an area is, could influence the types of PFAS found?
It certainly points towards geography playing a role in the specific mix, the isomer composition of PFAS that the shrimp are exposed to.
Makes sense. Okay, so geography matters. What about the shrimp themselves? Did different species absorb PFAS differently?
Oh, absolutely. Big differences. The actual composition of PFAS varied quite a lot among the 7 species they looked at.
Like how?
Okay, so PFOS, we mentioned it was high in red rice prawn, made up 66% of the total PFAS in that species. Huge proportion. It was also significant in Shiba shrimp, about 23%.
Wow, 66% in one species.
Yeah. When you add others, PFHXS was highest in Akiami paste shrimp, PFHPS in Sakura shrimp, PFUnDA, one of the main ones overall, was most dominant in Japanese glass shrimp and that Alaskan pink shrimp.
So each species almost has its own PFAS signature.
Kind of, yeah. Even PFOA, another well-known one, had its highest share in krill. And PFNA in Shiba shrimp. It's quite a complex picture.
What drives those differences? Is it what they eat? Where they live in the water?
The study suggests it's likely a combination of factors. Their specific habitat, bottom dweller versus open water, their diet, what prey species they consume, which might have their own PFAS profiles, even their vertical distribution in the water column.
Right, like the Alaskan pink shrimp are omnivores with a varied diet, you said.
Yes, while Akiyami paste shrimp are bottom dwellers in shallow areas, Sakura shrimp live deeper. These ecological differences likely influence exposure.
And what about that really high PFOS in the red rice prawn? Any clues there?
That one was noted as needing more research. They were peeled, which might be a factor, or maybe it's their specific food sources. It wasn't immediately clear from this data.
Okay, so lots of variability. Now, how does this one study fit into the bigger picture? Have other studies found similar things elsewhere?
Good question. Comparing findings is always important. The researchers mentioned that the PFOS levels they found in shrimp from these Asian coastal waters seem generally comparable to other studies from China, for example.
Okay, so some regional consistency there for PFOS.
Yes. But interestingly, they also cited work showing PFOS levels in North Sea shrimp seem to have decreased over time, perhaps reflecting regulations.
Oh, that's hopeful. What about PFOA?
For PFOA in Asian coastal shrimp, there might be a hint of a decreasing trend, which is also potentially good news. But PFNDA levels seem pretty consistent with past findings.
And those long-chain PFCAs you mentioned being high in Japan.
Yeah, the study notes that the widespread presence of these long-chain PFCAs seems to be a feature in East Asian shrimp across various studies. So that finding seems robust.
Got it. The study also used something called factor analysis. Sounds statistical. What did that show?
Right. It's a statistical technique to find underlying patterns in complex data. Basically, it supported the idea we discussed earlier. Within Japan, there seemed to be region-specific contamination patterns for those longer-chain PFCAs.
Ah, reinforcing the geographical link?
Exactly. Whereas the shorter-chain PFAS showed more consistent levels across the broader Southeast Asian region sampled.
And does that connect to human exposure?
It aligns, interestingly. The study points out that other research has found higher levels of long-chain PFCAs in human blood serum in Japan compared to some other places. So the shrimp data might reflect a broader regional exposure pattern.
Yeah. Okay, that connection is important, which brings us to the big question. What does eating this shrimp mean for our health? What's the risk?
Right, the crucial point. The study did estimate dietary intake. For the average Japanese consumer, they estimated the daily intake of total PFAS from shrimp is around 0.43 nanograms per kilogram of body weight per day.
0.43 Ingleday. How does that stack up against safety guidelines?
Well, for someone eating a lot of shrimp, that level could start approaching the tolerable weekly intake, or TWI, set by EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority.
Okay, so average might be okay, but heavy consumption is a potential concern. What about specific PFAS, like PFOS and PFOA?
For those two, based on average shrimp consumption, the estimated daily intake was actually a pretty small percentage of the tolerable daily intakes set by the U.S. ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry.
So individually, maybe less concerning on average.
On average, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But EFSA also has a TWI for the sum of 4 specific PFAS, PFOA, PFNA, and PFSXS.
Ah, combined limit.
Right. And the estimated weekly intake of those 4 combined from average shrimp consumption was about 22% of that EFSA TWI.
22%. So a noticeable chunk, but still well below the limit for an average consumer.
Correct. But again, average is key. What if you love shrimp or mostly eat one specific kind?
Yeah, did they look at that?
They did calculate the maximum amount of each specific shrimp species someone could theoretically eat daily before hitting those ATSDR or EFSA limits. And guess which one flagged the highest potential risk based on that combined EFSA threshold?
Let me guess. The red rice prawn with the high PFOS.
Oh, you got it. That species showed the lowest allowable consumption amount based on the combined 4 PFAS.
So takeaway on health is, what? Low risk generally, but be mindful.
Pretty much. Based on this data, average shrimp consumption in Japan probably doesn't pose a significant health risk according to current guidelines. But frequent consumption, especially of certain species like the red rice prawn, could increase your exposure and potential risk. And risk is often higher for children due to their lower body weight.
Right. Always important to consider vulnerable groups. Now, you mentioned data limitations earlier. Every study has them. What were the main ones here?
They were quite transparent about it. One thing is they often analyzed just one species from one specific location, making it hard to fully disentangle whether high levels were due to the species or the location.
Makes sense.
Also, the method they used for some of the longer chain PFCAs, C13, C15, wasn't ideal, potentially underestimating those levels slightly.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, they didn't look at where in the shrimp the PFAS accumulates, like muscle versus shell, and most samples were analyzed whole. That could matter depending on how people prepare and eat shrimp.
True. Some people eat the heads or shells.
Exactly. And the consumption data used for the risk assessment lumped shrimp and prawns together, but the study found prawns tended to have higher PFAS levels. And finally, the toxicology part was mostly based on weight, not molar concentration, which is a finer detail but relevant scientifically.
Okay, those are all good points for context. So let's try to wrap this up. What are the main nuggets we should pull from this deep dive?
I'd say first, PFAS are definitely present in edible shrimp sold in Japan, found in all samples tested here. Second, PFOS and PFUnDA were the most common, but the overall levels and the specific mix of PFAS vary significantly by species and location.
And third, those long-chain PFCAs seem particularly notable in Japanese coastal waters.
Correct. Fourth, the initial health risk assessment suggests low risk for the average shrimp consumer based on current guidelines. But fifth, potential concerns exist for people who eat a lot of shrimp or specific types with higher concentrations.
So it really highlights how our diet can be a pathway for exposure to these persistent chemicals.
Absolutely. And it underscores why we need ongoing monitoring of seafood and other foods, plus more research to understand the sources of these chemicals and their long-term health implications.
Definitely. Which kind of leads to a final thought for you, the listener. Considering how widespread PFAS seems to be, what other everyday foods maybe deserve a closer look like this? What questions should we be asking about potential contaminants in the food we rely on every day? Something to chew on.